record. This little Market Watch widget here, whenever you sign into MLS, is really good stuff. You know, it's saying in the last 7 days, we've taken 670, this is market wide, 674, sold 5.2, pending 664, and price decreased 821. That number continues to amaze me because every one of those are new listings in effect. And if you go and look at them, you can see that while some of them are small, 1%, many of them are significant. There's a 9% reduction. And again, we can sort this by the subcontinent name. We can add columns on here and take a look at what the days on market is. And you can kind of use this every day to gauge what's going on in the market, especially if you are working in an area or farming an area. There's a 15%er in Naples Park. That's pretty big. One reduction there. Came on the market at 1350. And okay, so I think it was they didn't put it on at the right price. All right, I got that. But anyhow, you can use this to stay in touch with your customers in an area. Maybe they're looking in an area, maybe they're thinking about listing. You can use this as a great tool every day to just kind of brush yourself up on the market. And I do it every morning. I go in there and look, I see what's going on. The other thing that's still significant is all these back on markets. So all of these properties, 161 of them in the last 7 days, came back on the market. And also may have had a price decrease. So again, this is a great way to kind of figure out what's going on in the market. You can do a quick sort by subcondo, just so you can see what's going on in the market. And I like to use it. I use it every day just to see what's happening. So just a word that we really need in this market to be as current and up to date with the market as we possibly can to give the best information out to the customers. And so with that, I'm going to start with the market stats that I just produced this morning. These will come out at the sales meetings on Tuesday and Wednesday, but I'll start you with the market stats so we can see what's happening in the market. And I need to stop share and share. Okay, let's start with Collier, June, comparing 2023 to 2022. As you're going to see on the bar graphs here in a couple minutes, you're going to see that this is the beginning of a kind of a new message from the market, in that the market was very, very active from January in 22 to maybe May, June, July. But by July, the market had gone back down quite a bit, and even now below 23. So we're going to start to see these numbers flip starting in July to where June of 20 or where July of 23 maybe start looking a little better than July of 22. So you want to make sure that you're getting this message out to the customers that the market, although it's not as vibrant as it was in 21 and 22, is still doing pretty well in the whole market. So take a look at median prices have stabilized quite a bit. And days on market still going up. That number in 2019 was 90, 88, 89, and 90. So 3 years later, it's still half of what it was post-COVID. New listings down 27%. That's not an unusual number comparing to 2021 or 2022, excuse me. But if you couple that with the number of price decreases that we're seeing, it's still quite a bit of supply coming into the market, both with new listings and price reduction. So make sure that your customers understand that, you know, there's still opportunity out there, and we can look at it by area they're looking in, area that they're thinking of selling in. And we can get a lot of information to them, and the information is what I think makes the difference in terms of getting a listing or getting a buyer to agree to a sale. Pending's up a little bit. That's a good sign. That means that our forward look is trending upward a little bit. And as I said, I think you'll start to see the 2023 numbers start to begin to outshine the 2022 numbers when we look at it month over month, beginning in June and July. Sales still down a little bit over last year, especially in condos. But look at up above that, prices, although they're not 100 like they were a year ago, they are still holding. The market's not giving us any sign of crashing. Volume's down, but prices are holding above 95%, which means that there's flexibility for buying, but not for the buyer that says, I think I'll sit and wait till the market crashes. That's probably not going to happen. And for every month that they delay thinking it's going to get worse, they're giving up the appreciation that they could have if they were willing to make a buy and negotiate a good deal. Inventory is still very much in the seller's column, climbing up over 4 months in single family, but overall 3.9 months, still well short of a 6 month that we consider as a balanced market. So the inventory is growing, we know that, but it's not growing at a rate that's going to put us into a balanced or buyer's market. All right, let's see what else we got here. So can you see that okay, or do I need to change my share? Somebody, anybody?
I can see it, Jeff.
Maybe zoom in a little bit. I'm not saying I have old eyes.
Okay, I can do that. We can make this come up a little bit. Let's say we want to go. How's that?
Much better.
Thank you.
In Collier County. Look at the growth. The light green bar is the growth in number of properties available for sale. Still well above a year ago, but starting to flatten out a little bit. And new listings is blue. But look, if I compare new listings in June and July to new listings in May and June of 23. We actually went up a little bit first part of the year. Now we're trending down a little, not unusual for the summer. But if you look at, draw a line across for pendings, pendings actually look a little bit better now than they did a year ago. That's why we're starting to see an increase in pendings. So the conclusion of the graph is that June was a neutral market. But you're starting to see that we're getting away from the big trend down from 21 to 22 to 23. All right, let's look at. So this is a chart that shows median prices and the month supply based on closed sales. Slightly different measure than the one that we use for the overall stats, but based on closed sales, 3.5 months supply overall in June of this year. And notice in June of last year, we were at 2.3, but we started to jump up quite a bit. But look at pricing. Pricing is actually a little bit higher than it was last June, median price. But the growth in that we saw in median flattening out quite a bit. Prices are stable. And our friend absorption, you can see that this is what we saw starting in April down through May, starting into June. Notice that in June, we were still around 45. But not starting in July, the absorption is better in this June than it was last July. So we're going to start to see a change in the year-over-year comparisons in the market. And we're going to see that 23 relative to 22 is, from an absorption standpoint, getting a little bit better. Hopefully that will put a little bit more of a positive spin on the market. Okay, so now I need to do Lee County. Okay. Need to reshare Lee County. There we go. Okay, Lee County, slightly different picture, but overall very similar. Median price is actually trending down a little bit, but definitely flattening. Days on market up, not quite as high as Collier, but still average turnover still pretty good. Listings down a little bit, pendings up. So we're starting to see year-over-year comparisons show an increase for 23. Sales down still quite a bit, especially condos. And month supply a little higher in Lee than Collier, but not much. Again, the rate of increase over last year is starting to flatten out. Absorption still 28% overall, 30%, meaning a little less than 1 out of 3 units is being absorbed every month. So obviously that's not what we saw a year ago, but it's starting to become the norm, as is the amount of inventory out there. Nobody sees a huge change in the amount of inventory when talking to some of the other brokers and everything, that we're going to live, in the 3,000 active range for quite a while, unless new construction is starting to become better. I know that having been involved in a couple of new construction contracts, the new construction should start to improve as a percentage of our sold properties, because they're not waiting 6 months for windows and 3 months for doors. Most everybody's is able to get the supply, assuming they can get the labor, they get the supply of materials that they need to start finishing these projects. So we'll start to see new construction delays reduced a little bit, which I think we'll see reflected in our pendings and also reflected in the market for new construction. All right. Let's see. Go back here. So Lee County still quite a significant growth in available properties for sale. Units. Obviously, there are more transactions in Lee County than Collier, but take a look at the new listings, which did quite well in the beginning of the season, starting up from December, and now we're flattening out a little bit. Pendings the same, but still very close to maybe a little bit more than they were a year ago. So we're starting to see the year-over-year, month-over-month comparisons change quite a bit. Okay. Let's see. And wait a minute, one more. Okay, prices again, very flat. Not much activity. Where we saw in the early months of 22 and 21, we saw a positive increase in median prices every month. So prices stable. Inventory still going up a little bit. It peaked, it looks like, in January, but still quite a bit of month supply out there, giving buyers more choices. And then, of course, we'll look at absorption. Again, the absorption a year ago is still pretty high relative to what it is now. But as it starts to trend down into the summer, you'll start to see the absorption in Lee being pretty much as good as it was a year ago. All right. So the message to our buyers and sellers is the market is stable. There's not any indication that we're going to have a big crash. Clearly, the interest rates and whatever the Fed does to try to combat inflation will affect the housing market. And on today on the growth call for Keller Williams corporate, they're saying now we may see total sales in 2023 below 4 million. Whereas in 2021 and 2022, we saw a peak in 2021 of 6.3 million. So the name of the game is, yes, there's still business out there. Yes, people still have motivation to buy and sell, but there's not going to be as many units. And they said in the growth call that if you sold 5 units this year to date, you were in the top 8% of the country. So clearly the number of unit sales is down. Pricing's holding pretty well, so that we're still seeing decent revenue per sale. But it's a time for our agents to go get their fair share. We have the tools, we have a lot of information for sellers to try to price it right. And it's pretty important that we take a look at and make sure the pricing is good. All right, let me stop the share. Let me grab this chart real quick here one more time. Where's that chart? See if I can find it real quick. There we go. All right, let me reshare here. Oh, well. There we go. Okay, so I showed this at the last couple sales meetings. I'd just like to show it again because I think it's whoops, that's a little too big. Come on down. Okay, so what I'm hearing and listening to a lot of the masterminds is when you look at how you're going to set up your pricing, obviously you've got an idea of what the market price and the investor price are by looking at your comps and seeing what they are, and then working with your seller to arrive at a price that's going to give them the best opportunity to sell. And a lot of the top producing agents on these calls are saying, hey, you know, one of the opportunities you have is to start out with an initial price that is not necessarily way below the market, but it's very close to the bottom of the market, given the features and benefits that you have. So obviously, if you saw it that sold for 560 3 months ago with no updating, and you have a unit that has complete renovations, I'm not saying you go 560 because that's the comp. I'm saying you add for the features and benefits, but then try to go as aggressively as you can. And what they're seeing is if they go in at an aggressive price, they often sell more than list because they get a lot of activity, they get showings, they get offers, and a lot of times multiple offers result in that because the price is attractive and we're now catching a lot of the fish in the sea and not helping to sell somebody else's property. So, you know, if we go through these top 5 here, we can always come down. We know that in this market, that is a really losing strategy. You can see what happens up here. You're going to end up chasing the market down, and the seller is going to end up with less. Just saying. When you start chasing the market down, you're sending a signal to buyers that you need to sell, and you probably were way overpriced when you started. And what are you going to see in offers? Generally not full list price offers. So I think the idea of starting a little high and coming down is not a great strategy for sellers in this market. again, putting the property on the market at an unrealistic price. That's what we see when we see the number of price reductions exceeding the number of new listings in the market. That is people that said, well, I guess we need to sell, and I guess we priced it too high. The consumers are really taking a heavy toll on the sellers that use that strategy, because they're either ignoring the property or they're going to come in with a much lower offer because they see a big trend down from the original list price to the current price. Okay. Thinking that buyers are comparing your home on a dollar to dollar basis. I would say we have probably one of the most educated consumers. They have platforms, Realtor.com, Zillow. They have platforms that give them a lot of information and an easy way to set up comparisons, an easy way to watch a property. So I think when you think that the buyers are going to pay more for your home because you have green granite, I think that's where sellers are starting to be in love with their house for all the wrong reasons. The market is very active. There's less supply than demand, but the homes that are selling are the ones that are priced right. And I think that if there's any message you get from today is price it right, or you could be, taking a lot of time to get your seller to the promised land. All right. So let's talk a little bit about one of the later developments in the industry. And I'm going to start with just kind of a run through of a slideshow that Sam Sod, one of our local attorneys, put on. Effective July 1st, a statute went into effect in Florida that basically restricts certain political groups and members of certain countries from purchasing properties in Florida, especially agricultural and properties that are located nearby strategic water treatment plants, military bases, power plants, anything that would create we'll see it within a 10-mile radius of one of these strategic events. So I'm going to flip through this just so you'll be aware of it, because awareness is the key. So I'm using these slides from Sam, but he gave me permission, so no worries. What the overall purpose of this reactive bill is to prevent foreign principals from certain countries and certain regimes from purchasing agricultural land or real property near military bases and critical infrastructure, and specifically mentions Chinese buyers and owners of real property. Okay, so we have to proceed as real estate professionals with extreme caution here, because this is, kind of right on the edge, if not over the edge, with our ethics regarding fair treatment to equal housing treatment under the fair housing laws. So I want you to be aware of it. The law took effect July 1st. There was a hearing, an objection for a stay has already been filed. There's a hearing on July 18th. We may get a delay in this, but as we are going now, you need to proceed as though you're aware of this, and we need to be very careful with how we approach these situations with the customers. So here's some definitions: agricultural land, critical infrastructure facility, and a foreign entity. All right. Again, I don't want to get too deep in this. There are 3 sessions at NABOR beginning this week, taught by attorneys to go into this in more detail. But I just want you to, awareness is my goal here today. All right. So definition of a foreign principal, definition of a military installation. And here's the associated with the People's Republic of China. So you'll see here People's Republic of China, Communist Party, any official of any other political party or member of party in the People's Republic of China. So these are specifically definitions of people that are involved in are directly purchasing property that are members of China, the Republic of China, the Chinese party, or a political party in China. Partnership, association with, so it could be a partnership or a group of investors that having their principal place in China. And any person that's domiciled here, but does not have a permanent residency or a visa other than a tourist visa. Okay, so any one of the people that are in this definition from China are affected by this law. So here are the foreign countries of concern: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, the Venezuelan regime of Nicolas Maduro, and the Syrian Republic. And these were targeted specifically by the law. Again, we are not in a position to comment or advise any buyer or seller regarding this law. We are wanting them to have awareness, but we're not wanting to be involved in any type of discussion about it. We should send them directly to a legal expert to give them advice if they're thinking of buying, or if they have a buyer and they're not sure of the buyer's origin. So this is section 5, purchase of agricultural lands by foreign principals. One of the things that has taken place is a map has been made of Florida showing the available architectural land that isn't near a critical infrastructure, and it's really a very small amount of land. So it really doesn't affect Florida as it has out in the western states, where thousands of land around military bases has been purchased by foreign nationals. And I guess there's, a growing security concern to the extent that Florida legislature drafted and passed a law. Notice that FREC is required to adopt rules. We haven't heard from FREC. And foreign principals that acquire agricultural land after July 1 will have to register with the Department of Economic. They just changed the name of it, but anyhow, they have to register with a Florida Economic Commission, and the registration process hasn't even been released yet. So a lot of things early on in this law that are that are really hard to figure out. But this is purchase of property on or around military or critical infrastructure. Okay, there is an exception here for foreign principals who are natural persons, meaning that they're U.S. citizens, as long as the property is not located within 5 miles of any military installation, person with a U.S. visa, not limited to tourism, and the purchase is in the name of the person who holds the visa or official documentation to be able to be a occupant of the United States. Okay. Foreign principals may acquire real property within 10 miles in the state by device or descent, though the enforcement of security. Because, so let's say a foreign principal gets a hold of an ownership of a property because of a debt, or that they have secured a debt with property, they can acquire this land, but they have to sell it within 3 years. So there's not a lot of flexibility in this statute. The DEO is the Department of Economic Opportunity, and I think it's being renamed, but that's what it is right now. So there's no registration process at this time, and all we know is that this law took effect July 1st, and we need to be aware of it. Notice that land acquired in violation of the statute may be forfeited to the state. So from a buyer standpoint, obviously, we aren't there to determine, what their country of origin is and all that. But I believe it's only fair that we advise people that as of July 1st, The contracts have been changed and they need to sign an affidavit at closing saying they're not one of these groups. If they do so and are one of those groups and falsify the affidavit, there's there's severe criminal penalties for that. The ditto for a seller who knowingly sells property to a member of this group. Now, if the seller has his property listed, a buyer's agent comes along, engineers the sale, and it turns out this person's not qualified to buy it, then the way the law works is the person gets their money back. But the seller only the seller's in trouble if they have knowledge that the buyer may be one of, part of one of these groups. This goes back to people from the People's Republic of China are defined here. FREC is required to adopt rules. They haven't done them yet. So a lot of this is very early on, and a lot of this is based on the particular origin of the buyer. So what does this mean for closings? All buyers must sign an affidavit attesting that they're in compliance with the law. So what is that? What does that mean to us? What it means to us is, can you not see this? Did I not share this?
We can't see anything.
No.
Yeah, you can. Okay. I was basically going through, and this is the most important slide, okay? What this means is that the buyer has to sign an affidavit with the closing agent that they're in compliance with the law, that they're not a member of any of the groups we talked about. And it's not essential that you know all the definitions and everything. It's essential that you know that every buyer has to sign this affidavit, okay? There's criminal liability to buyers who violate the statute and sign the affidavit, what are one of those groups. They could actually lose their property, okay? There's criminal liability to a seller for selling to a foreign, knowingly sell to a seller that's a foreign principal. There's criminal liability to title companies who don't do the affidavit or that are assisting buyers, knowing that they're part of that group. There's no apparent criminal liability to realtors, okay? But I think it's important that we know that we advise a buyer and a seller of the situation and that the law is in effect, and that buyer has to sign an affidavit that they're in compliance with the law at close. So even though these buyers have nothing to do with any of these groups, they're going to be required to sign this affidavit. And I just think that is information they need to have somewhere, early on in the transaction, or at least they need to know that it's going to happen at closing, because as realtors, we are always at the center of the transaction, and we'll probably get the question, why didn't you tell me that I had to sign this affidavit? So I think it's important that you be aware of the law and be aware of at least letting your buyers know that there is this law in effect, and that if they have any questions about their eligibility for the purchase of the property, they need to know that that's there. But beyond that, I don't think we want to get involved at all in discussing those groups or our opinions of them, or whether or not we think it's a violation of fair trade. We just need to be aware, and we're going to have probably some type of a disclosure that we're probably going to ask your buyers to sign, or at least present it to them so they're aware of the process and they aren't they aren't surprised at closing that they're required to sign this. So it's just something that we don't know what's. There is a challenge on July 18th. There's going to be a hearing, and the Justice Department has filed a brief saying it's a violation of the Federal Housing Act which it probably could be considered by a lot of people to be that. And the issue here is, 26 other states have similar legislation. So I don't think that the courts are gonna bury their head in the sand and say, hey, this is just not legal. In other states, have been deemed legal, and it is restricting certain purchases. So again, I think we kind of wish that they would have given us a little more time to get organized here. The seminar introducing all Florida realtors was held on June 30th. So, you have as much information really as I do, other than the fact that if you're interested, NABOR has 3 classes this month, one on Wednesday and one the following week and one the week after that. Generally in the afternoon for an hour, have lawyers presenting information to you. You want a little bit more information and you want to be involved in the Q&A, that's great. So sorry about these slides, but actually there's way too much detail in here for what we know now. But it's important that would be for you to look at this slide and say, here are the foreign countries of concern from the law: People's Republic of China, Russian Federation, Islamic Republic of Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuelan regime of Nicolas Maduro. So don't ask me how we're going to tell if somebody's a member of the Nicolas Maduro regime, but it's in the law, and the Syrian Arab Republic. So those are the groups that are affected. Are there any questions, comments? It's a sticky wicket, and we're trying to do the right thing by our customers, of which how many are we going to have that even fall into these groups? So we'll be
A
moving.
lot of gray.
The FARBAR contract has already been amended. The NABOR contract is in the process of being amended to add a disclaimer into the contract, and you can probably stop. I gotta make it bigger. Something out of this one. This one. Okay, so this is the FARBAR. There, it's in the commercial contract. It's in the as-is contract, and it's in the updated FARBAR. You'll notice that at the bottom of the FARBAR, it's now been revised as of 7/23. So there's no specific mentions in the contract other than right here. You'll notice above the signature line, this language. Now you can say, well, if this buyer and the seller are going to sign this, why should we be, worried about it? Because how many of you send contracts with your DocuSign or .loop signatures in them, and the customer goes ding, 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 back to you. And then when this stuff comes up, they're like, well, why didn't you tell me it was in the contract? So from a legal standpoint, the attorney's opinion is if a buyer and seller sign this, they're signing that they acknowledge that what's happening here is a part of the law and that they need to accommodate it. But from a practical standpoint, how many people are going to sign this contract and not read that paragraph? Just as they don't necessarily always read a wire fraud paragraph. So a little bit of concern here. Obviously, if you're starting to work with a buyer, Jeff Jones, you probably don't think he's from a foreign country of concern, but I could be. And the other side of the coin is if I introduce myself as Vladimir Jones, are you going to immediately jump to the fact that I'm, part of this group? The answer is no. So we have to be careful. Obviously, there's all kinds of fair housing implications here that we have to be careful with, but I think there's a fine line between awareness and involvement. So we're working on that now, and we'll try to come up with something. I just want you to be, as part of the contract class, I want you to be aware of this and what's going on. Okay?
Mhm.
All right, so I think what we were talking about today was best practices for the FARBAR contract. And since we just had the FAR bar contract up there, we'll go back and talk a little bit about FAR bar. I always like to use the regular FAR bar contract because the as is differs only in the inspection section. So key elements of FAR bar contract are, we'll go through these and we got a little bit of time here. So obviously you need to worry about the seller. You need to go to the LIPA.org if it's in Lee County, or call your appraiser.com, and you need to get a hold of the deed. The deed is the designation of who actually owns the property. Regardless of what's in an MLS, regardless of what you know the seller to be, if you're representing a buyer and you don't get the correct nomenclature for the seller, your contract is not worth the paper it's printed on. So it could be, if you don't name all the parties, could be a homestead violation. If it's an estate, it needs to have a personal representative. If it's a trust, it needs to have a trustee. So make sure that you know exactly what's going on from the deed and don't rely on what the listing agent put in MLS. And if you have any questions, obviously we encourage you in all cases to call the listing agent before you submit an offer to find out a little bit about what's going on with the property. Are there other offers? Are there things that the seller would like to see in the offer? That would give us a favorable position. Does the seller need any type of post-closing occupancy? You know, what information can you give me that will help me to write a great offer? So always have that conversation with the listing agent, and don't be afraid to ask, because the worst the listing agent can say is, I can't share that information. But you can certainly legitimately ask if there's other offers. If the seller allows the listing agent, you may be able to get more information. Are they financed? Are they above list? But always make that call. I get calls from agents all the time, and they say, well, you know, the property's on the market for $850. My buyer wants to offer $675. What do you think? And I'm like, well, it's a little bit unusual in this market to see an offer that low, get any kind of consideration. Why don't you call the listing agent and find out, you know, what offers they have, where they stand. And oftentimes I'll get a call back saying, gee whiz, I called the listing agent and they have 4 offers above list price. So therefore my $675 on $850 is probably not worthy of a lot of further consideration. So always make that call. And if there's a question about an estate or a trust, certainly ask the listing agent if there's more information available. But again, go to the deed. I believe if you write the contract based on the deed, you'll probably be okay. We're all the way down to line 2. So I think a great question for the buyer is, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer, or Mr. Buyer or Ms. Buyer, how do you want to take title of this property? And if they say, well, you know, I really would like to put it in an LLC, or I'd like to form a revocable trust, and you want to know about that up front. If it's like, no, I'm just going to take title in my own name or my spouse's name, no problem. But good question to ask. Yes, under most conditions, the buyer can change the way they take title in the contract, a checkbox of whether that's assignable or not. And if it's not assignable, then you have to have specific permission from the seller to take title in a different form. All right. The street address comes from again, all this information can come from the property appraiser. And again, the legal description, pretty important. Most of the time, the legal description will fit right on there. You can take it right off of the property appraisers. If you can certainly attach a more lengthy description. Really, unless you get out into the estates where you've got meets and bounds and legal descriptions that are a paragraph long, you can fit it on here, but understand that the legal description always trumps the street address. If there's any dispute. So here we are in Far Bar. And Far Bar has a very much a skeleton definition of what real property is included. All right, and what personal property is included. So, for example, does anybody see the washer and dryer in lines 15 to 20? Nope. Does anybody see microwaves? So if you don't specifically include them and make sure your buyer wants them, want somebody else's washing machine, which is fine. But if they do want the washing machine, a relatively new and good condition, you got to put it on line 21, or you could be headed with your friendly credit card to Best Buy or another appliance dealer to provide them when the buyers are expecting to have it and it's not there when you go to do your walkthrough. So be careful to make sure that 21 and 22 have more specificity. In the NABOR contract, we go to great lengths to detail automated home equipment, things like that. But if there's things in there that there's an iPad hanging on the wall that's driving the lighting and the air conditioning systems and all, then that needs to be specifically included in your contract. And it's always a good idea for you to be on the same page as your buyer as to what the buyer is expecting when they go to the walkthrough inspection. And even though it says personal property included in the purchase price has no contributory value and shall be left to the buyer, lenders don't often like that. They don't often recognize that. So if your list includes furniture or other, personal items, paintings, stereo equipment, things like that, even an external hot tub, the lenders are liable to make you amend the contract to get those things off of there and onto a separate inventory. So if your buyer is financing, there's a lot of things that probably shouldn't be on that list, but you could do a separate inventory and have the buyer and seller sign off on it so that there's no question when you go to the walkthrough inspection, there's no drama. Drama is not a good thing for a real estate agent going to a walkthrough and having his buyer say, "Where is this stuff?" That's really a kind of a Maalox moment you don't want to have. If there's exclusions from the purchase, those probably would come from from a list that may be provided in MLS or a list that the listing agent provides you when you're getting ready to roll the contract. Broker Jeff's not a big fan of exclusion because if all you have is an exclusion list, and let's say you've got a turnkey property, how do you know? You have to be very keenly aware that everything that you don't have an inventory, everything that's there is there, except those excluded. That's sometimes tough to do. Sometimes the family will provide an exclusion list and then they'll say, well, we'll take this, and we'll take that, nobody will notice. So be careful with exclusion lists because they can be misleading. Okay. Purchase price. Initial deposit, I always recommend that it be wired to the escrow agent within 3 days, 4 days, 5 days tops. The effective date, so you're not running around trying to get a check from your buyer, get it to the escrow agent, and even though now you can take a picture of the check and do it electronically, I still think that running around with checks. I think it's important to use the wires when you can. You don't want to handle the money. Your buyer doesn't want to run around writing checks. So within 3 days or 5 days of the effective date. Because oftentimes you might write a couple of different contracts along the way. And you don't want to have a check each time. So there you go. 33 to 35 is a Florida law required to name the escrow agent. And it has to be a legitimate person. And it does not always have to be the closing agent. So if your buyer's paying for title, just checks that box. You have the right for the buyer to select the title agent. And if you don't know who that is, you want to make sure that you have an escrow agent. Now, in some cases, Title Alliance will hold escrow for you while you're figuring out what or an attorney or whoever your likely closing agent is, it has to be filled in. There was a lot of fraud committed back in the big run up of 2004, 5, and where people were naming their brother, their aunt, their uncle, and no money was changing hands. So the state cracked down at that point and said, wait a minute, escrow is an important part of the contract. It has to be held by a legitimate person at arm's length, so that there is a dispute. It has to be resolved legally. Now, remember in bar contract, all deposits are at risk from day one. So if you put on line 28, put down on line 37, 50,000, and your buyer goes into default for whatever reason, the seller's entitled to all deposits, whether they've been made or not. And so you have to be very careful. All dates in this contract are time of the essence. You miss a deposit, inspection date, you miss any of the critical dates in this contract, and your buyer's entire deposits made or just pledged are the remedy of the seller. So be careful with that. That's a huge difference between contract and NABOR, because NABOR is only deposits made to date if there's a default. Remember that lines here, which can be 80%, or it can be a dollar amount that the buyer is protected from, should they not be able to get their loan. So you have to be a little careful there. If the buyer's putting down a amount and the appraisal comes in slightly different, the lender can say, my loan to value is just a few points higher, I'll approve the loan. So it isn't always automatic. Property doesn't appraise that the buyer will get denied and get their money back. But that number there is the number that's being for the buyer if they get their loan. Other might be used for seller financing or seller holding. And we're starting to see some more creative happening as sellers are, loan over 7%. Sellers are now starting to say, well, I'll hold 50,000, at 4% or 5%, because that's a lot more than they're getting from their savings account. So there's starting to be a little more creativity in there. The time for acceptance, 45, is a drop dead date. If an offer is made and countered, or if an offer is made and the the seller signs, anytime after the date there. And if you don't put a time, it goes to midnight that day. But I'll bet you I get at least half a dozen contracts every month where that time had expired before the response was received from the seller. Do I have a contract? Nope. And the issue is not that it's, an egregious error. It's a problem if the buyer or the seller decide that they want out of the contract and they take this document to an attorney who says, this is an expired offer. So be careful with that. Also be careful of your 2 days for counter offers. And also be careful that it's, according to line 44, an executed copy delivered to all parties. So it's accepted and delivered. That's the standard. So even though a seller may counter an offer and the buyer is thinking about it, and another offer comes in that's better, the seller can say, I rescind my counter offer, I'm gonna take this other offer. You'll respond timely, and you ought to understand that if you're very close, the seller could get another better offer while you're thinking about it. So understand the time back and forth, and that the fact that all these dates end at midnight, unless you put 5 p.m. on July 10th, it goes to midnight, which is my suggestion, because you know, if the thing comes back, the offer comes back at 6 o'clock at night and you had 5 there, now you've got to do an addendum. All parties agree to extend the date, so try to give a couple of days for a buyer to consider and sign. Not, well, I'm writing the offer, so I want it to go at 5 o'clock today. No, that's not giving people enough time to consider their options. And sometimes you put too much pressure on somebody, they may just say, oh, the heck with it, going down the road. So be careful with that. Closing date, like all other dates in the FAR contract, time of the essence. The extensions, excuse me, of the closing date are required for both parties to agree to extend a closing date. There's a slight exception in here that it's if the buyer's lender is not able to perform, then the closing date can be extended up, but cannot be 10 days. In the neighbor contractor, you'll have to go, oh, well, you can extend it automatically for 10 days. No, and neither can you do this one. It's strictly if you have a clear to close, the lender is not able to deliver the package, you can extend up to 7 days, but you also need to do it in writing. It doesn't automatically happen that, hey, we're supposed to close today at 4 o'clock. We don't have the package yet. What can we do? You can notify the other side that you're going to take a little extra time to get the job done. As long as the buyer has a clear to close, it's probably okay. Paragraph 6 is occupancy. This is a sore subject for a lot of different solutions there. Generally, this contract defines closing as the closing agent says we're closed. Doesn't mean that the seller has the money in their account yet. It could be out on the wire. Doesn't mean that funds still in flow, but it means that the closer has all the documents and funds they need to call it a closing. And at that point, then I think you have to be careful to turn the keys over and not make a fuss about it. It's a process that once the closing agent says we're closed, then I think you can move keys and fobs and garage door openers and all those other kinds of things without any problem. It's when you don't do it and the closer says it's closed, you could get in a little bit of trouble, especially if there's a weekend involved. If there's leases, check that box. If your buyer is buying this as an investment property and there's going to be rent coming in, then you need to sit down in great detail and work out how the transition is going to work so that the seller bequeaths all the leases and everything to the buyer, and also make sure that everything is tied up and the tenants don't owe him or her any money. So it's this process. If your buyer wants to do leasing, I suggest that you get a hold of this 5-day period to say, okay, I want to see all the leases in 5 days, or We can extend that, but that's a minimum. And make sure that your buyer's attorney or some legal professional has looked at all these leases to make sure they're legit, and also to make sure that any leases on the books are legit. We've had cases where the closing's coming up and the buyer seller says, well, I'm not gonna live in this place anymore. And so he rents it at some ridiculously low rent to his friends or colleagues or family. And that's where you have to be careful of. You don't want to inherit those leases where you're gonna lose money. So you want to make sure you look at those leases and that they're favorable. Assignability is where we talked a little bit about before. The buyer may assign the contract. Generally, the seller will never agree to release the buyer from liability, but may assign and not be released from liability is the box that I recommend, because if the buyer, for some reason, maybe they aren't sure when they start, but they want to take title in a different form, they can do so without the permission of the seller, but they still retain liability. When the box is checked, may not assign, then, or if no box is checked, the buyer can't assign the contract without approval from the seller. All right. Financing. The financing, obviously, A is a cash transaction. B is kind of interesting because broker Jeff doesn't like blanks. So if you've got a customer that is financing, make sure you go and check these boxes, because otherwise you leave them out, you could put your buyer in trouble with getting out of the contract because of financing contingency. So if there is a FHA loan, or a VA loan, you got to check those boxes, and you got to provide the FHA VA rider for this, in which all parties agree to certain things happening that otherwise in a regular mortgage might not happen. You want to make sure you check what type of mortgage it is, and line 93, initial interest rate. Here's where you can protect your buyer from having a situation where they get a sudden spike in interest rates like we've had in the last week, or their credit doesn't measure up to the rate that the lender quoted them when they quoted them based on the information they had from the customer. But maybe all of a sudden they look through this and so based on your credit history, you know, the best we can do for you is 7 3/4. Well, if you put 7 or 6 3/4 in there, the buyer can say, okay, I'm done. I don't want a loan at that amount, and I'm gonna walk away. So you can use the defaults, but the default for interest rates, prevailing rate based on buyer's credit worthiness. Wow, that could mean a fairly big swing upward if the buyer's credit isn't great, right? The buyer needs to make application within 5 days. You know, that's a number that is important because let's say the buyer, you know, says, well, I'm gonna wait till I get approved by the association, wait and see what the appraisal is, you know, all that kind of stuff. And they don't make the application timely or in good faith, they can lose the protection of financing contingency. And we have had cases where the buyer is, you know, oh, I'm gonna work with my lender from home. They don't require much, so I'm gonna drag, you know, I'm not gonna drag my feet, but I'm not gonna be timely with this application. And they find out that their lender in Ohio doesn't make Florida condominium loans, period. So, you know, you gotta be careful that you do this timely and that you make sure that the lender who's of record can make the deal happen. All right. So it's fundamentally what happens in this contract is there's a 30-day period or loan approval period on line 90. And at the end of that period, the buyer has to notify the seller of where they stand, okay? And the buyer can notify the seller that they are unable to obtain the loan with the loan approval. Or if they're unable to attend it, but they've got other means, they can say, okay, we're moving forward. But if they don't say anything, then the seller has a 3-day window to say, okay, I'm not happy with this. I want out. Here's your money back, Mr. Buyer, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, and I'm moving on. Or they can say, well, you didn't make it out by your date. We gave you extra time. We did this, we did that, or we did the other, and you're still not telling us about whether you qualify. Then I think we can safely say that you're gonna lose your deposit. There is a slight window at the end called, which was a big window before, called a property related condition, 127 down the lender comes back and says, okay, based on the 4-point inspection we ordered, you have to agree to put a new roof on within the next 5 months. You're like, I don't think I'm willing to do that. That's a property related condition. The buyer can get out. Can the buyer get out on appraisal like they used to? No. That's included up above here. And that's where that 30 days comes into play. And they have to notify the seller of loan approval, or they can move forward, but their deposit's firm. And remember, all deposits are firm, are at risk if the buyer defaults. So for some reason, they switched to another lender or switched to another plan. They didn't notify the seller timely. The seller can say, wait a minute, time out, I'm not giving you any extensions. You have to do it within the time period because you didn't bother to tell me. So. All right. Property related condition can also be that they have a rider that talks about the sale of their home. And if they're not able to sell their home, I think it's rider K, then they can still get out on those terms. Okay. All right, so this is another paragraph in the FAR/BAR contract, which is not totally understood, all right? The first paragraph here is cost to be paid by seller, okay? Anything in here is the seller's responsibility to pay. Now, how can you get around this and finesse it? You can do a seller's net sheet, and that seller's net sheet will delineate all the costs of the seller. Ditto for the buyer. Most buyers don't have any idea how much they have to bring to closing until they get the sticker shock of that closing statement, because they have to come up with a year of insurance or a year of HOA fees or vice versa. Lines 143 to 148 are really important to understand, and they are 3 buckets that are available in the FAR/BAR contract that define general repair, wood destroying organisms, or permits. Those buckets cannot be shared. They have to be one or the other. I think you have to be careful. Everybody usually just leaves this blank to 1.5% of the purchase price. If you've got a $300,000 home, that's only $4,500. That may not pay for an air conditioning repair or something of some significance. So make sure you allocate enough money to the bucket. 1.5% probably okay. It'll tend a house. 1.5% for closing open permits. Now, the reason that these limits are there as we go into the inspection paragraph is that the seller is responsible only up to the amount you put there. So if there's $8,000 worth of repairs and you've got a $4,500 limit, the seller can say to you, okay, Mr. Jones, I'm gonna make all the repairs that you show me that are defective conditions up to $4,500. Or the seller can say, you know, I'll fix all of it. It's not that big a deal. Then you have a nice seller, but the seller does have limits there. So even if you put a number in there, let's say $5,000 or $6,000, the seller can always bargain it down in a counter, but at least put enough money in there, if it's, especially if it's an older home, the AC's old, the roof's old, make sure you give yourself enough latitude in there to make sure you're covering, your buyer has enough room to make the necessary repairs. 151 to 157 basically is called the general maintenance requirement. Basically, the seller's maintenance obligation is I must maintain the property in the condition it was in when we went to contract, or I've got to pay for putting it back the way it was. So you went through your home inspection, the air conditioner passed muster, everything was good, and then you go for the walkthrough and there's, you know, everything's damp and sweaty and don't think the air conditioning's working here very well. You could have, you could raise the objection saying, okay, if I close tomorrow, I want you to escrow up to 125% of the cost of this repair, which you can get, hopefully you can get from an air conditioning contractor. But also in general, in the FAR/BAR contract, all these repairs have to be used licensed contractors and provide receipts, okay? Cost to be paid by the buyer. Again, if you have a closing fee that you're going to charge the buyer, you got to put that in on 170. That's your, if you're collecting a 295 charge or something like that from the buyer, that's the place to put it. So the next kind of key area of the contract is right here, 184 to, I don't really need the Miami-Dade, but 184 to 189, that's when you decide, is the buyer going to select the title agent and pay for title insurance, or is the seller going to select it? So to me, if I'm the buyer for the small amount of money that title policy costs, I'm going to be represented by the closing agent, and the closing agent's going to be pulling municipal lien searches and other things for me in my best interest. So my suggestion is, unless there's a severe economic limitation on the buyer, let the buyer pay the extra few $1,000s for the policy, but have complete control over the process. This paragraph 204 is a public body. It has nothing to do with condo or HOA special assessments that might have been assessed because of the storm or whatever. This is strictly public body. So this could be a sewer, like when you get up into on the Cape, a lot of those areas aren't yet serviced by sewers and waters, and they're gradually extending that north with an assessment. City of Benita's had an assessment for water and infrastructure. That basically says if these are paying installments, that if you check box on 210, that the buyer will pay the installments after closing, or you can ask the seller on 212, pay the whole thing. But make sure you understand that that has nothing to do with any of the condo or HOA special assessments that might come as a result of the storm or new project, new pool area, whatever. But that has nothing to do with this paragraph. So we go into the disclosures. It's interesting to note that in FAR/BAR, the radon gas is defined as a problem, but there is no way for a buyer to get out of a contract with high radon unless they put some specific language in the other terms and conditions. Let's say that, hey, if the radon's over 4, the seller refuses to remediate, I can cancel and get my money back. So depending upon your buyer, a lot of radon horror stories come from up north where they have a basement. And the soil that's holding in the basement has some radon in it from where it was dug. You can have very high levels of radon in the basement. And again, it's tied to any type of cardiovascular issues or breathing issues that the buyer might have. So it's always a good idea if you're going, if you're going to run a radon test, that you put this language in here. We got the language, just ask broker Jeff. It's just very simple. If radon is tested, the results over 4.0, the seller refuses to remediate, the buyer can cancel a contract and get the money back. Very simple language. But if you have a radon test and it comes back 8, and you don't have anything in the contract to protect the buyer, you know, you don't have really a lot of leverage with the seller. So here in permits, the seller is affirming that they know of no problems, that they haven't done any unpermitted additions, but many times the sellers don't know. They've hired a pool contractor or an air conditioning contractor or a roofing contractor to do the work. And it's their responsibility to do whatever permitting is required. But if the vendor doesn't properly pull the permits, doesn't close them out, then the seller, it's the seller's problem, unless the buyer signs that closing statement, in which case all of those issues go directly to the buyer. You can't say, well, I didn't know. You can't say, well, the seller should have done it. You can't say any of that stuff. So you have to be very careful with getting that municipal lien search done and making sure that anything that's open or a lot of times these permits are expired. They expire every so many days. I think it's 6 months in Collier. It varies, but when they expire, it doesn't mean that there's no longer any problem. It means that somebody at some point in time pulled a permit to do some work and never closed it out. So whether they did pull the permit and didn't do any work, fine, that's simple. What if they pulled the permit, put on a new roof, put in a pool, and didn't properly CO it? That could be many dollars, because we don't know, you know, if it wasn't CO'd, wasn't completed, why wasn't it completed? Was there issues that they failed inspections? You know, we really don't know, so you have to be careful with that. Obviously, flood insurance, tough stuff right now. The new FEMA 2.0 flood system, it does allow you to get a quote on your flood insurance in a very short period of time, where it used to take days before. But in many areas that were affected by coastal flooding or by Ian are seeing higher flood insurance rates. For the majority of the time in Florida, because Florida was a donor state for years, we put in $4 for every dollar we got back claims. It really, you know, was a different story. Now, especially if you're like on Marco Island or in a little bit of a higher risk area near the water where there's been some flooding, you could see significant changes in the flood insurance cost. Remember always, if you got a buyer, always ask the seller if they have flood insurance. For their declarations page, the buyer is able to assume the seller's policy. And even if that policy only has a couple months left on it, the buyer can assume it at that rate and then renew it. And if there's a big increase coming from the new rate, the buyer can buy flood insurance at that lower rate. And it can only be increased 18% per year. So it's a 6-year, could be a 6-year glide path to, you know, the new rate. So be careful that you stay on top of that, especially if you got a high flood insurance quote. And try to get these quotes, as I've said, like a broken record, try to get these quotes before you write the contract, because it can be a deal breaker, and there's nothing in this contract that allows somebody to get out of it because they can't get insurance at a reasonable rate. They can't get insurance at a reasonable rate. They can get insurance. It should probably be citizens or very limited coverage, but they don't necessarily want to do that. They want good coverage, but they don't want to pay a fortune. So this is the inspection period, which we talked about. This is general inspection and repair. And again, there's a whole definition in here of cosmetic conditions and defective conditions. So essentially in the regular contract, if the buyer's inspector finds things that are not in working condition and don't meet any of these normal wear and tear standards down around line 300, then the buyer can ask the seller to repair all of those defective items up to the general repair limit. And again, that's the seller's prerogative to say, you know, you put 5,000 in there, I'm not gonna repair up to 8,000. So you have to be a little careful with that and how you ask. Okay, so these are, remember the definitions of cosmetic and working conditions slightly different between FAR/BAR and NABOR, not a ton of things, but for example, torn screens are a defect in FAR/BAR and they're not a defect in NABOR. So just slight subtle differences. And remember the limit. And also remember that the repairs have to be done by qualified people and the buyer can ask for receipts in FAR/BAR. NABOR is kind of silent as to the receipt situation there. So WDO, termites, permits, we talked about permits and closing out and then let's talk a little bit about what I think is one of the most important parts of the contract, and that's the walkthrough inspection. And which also provides a re-inspection after a hazardous event occurs, i.e. a hurricane comes through. So the basically the seller is obligated to allow the buyer to come to do a walkthrough and or a re-inspection as if the property has experienced any type of a weather situation or any type of a fire or anything like that, the buyer does have the right to re-inspect. Okay, now you see in paragraph F, all repairs and replacements good and working condition by appropriate licensed person, according to law. And so basically that's defining exactly what needs to be done, and it has to be done by, you know, legitimate peeps. It can't be done, you know, haphazardly. And the seller will, at closing, assign all signable repair, treatment, and maintenance contracts and warranties to the buyer. Okay, so we're almost out of time here. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. The big difference, I think, that I'd like to point out before we sign off is what really was risk of loss and force majeure. If I can grab that real quick here. But essentially, the contract defines force majeure as a defined term. Let's see if we can get. And force majeure is defined in like a 3-line term, which is much different from the, there we go.
81, right?
What?
81 it's on, or is that force majeure? Okay, where you at? Sorry.
I'm on 532 here. You see that okay? So force majeure has a specific definition, and any of those events can be considered under the definition of force majeure. And if there's force majeure, this particular paragraph talks about the fact that if the services are unavailable, they can be extended up a reasonable time up to 7 days. If there's no power, no internet service, or no insurance, but if it goes more than 30 days, either party can terminate the contract. The difference, the big difference, I believe, comes down here in risk of loss. Right here on line 604. Okay, take a look at this first sentence. It basically says that, okay, we have a force majeure event, there's a casualty loss, and the cost to restore is more than 1.5% of the contract, then either party can cancel. and the buyer can get their money back. So if it's, doesn't exceed 1.5%, then the seller is required to pay it. Any unused portion of the escrow amount returned to the seller. So 1.5% in terms of some of the damage that we saw in Irma and and Ian, especially with surge. Not a very high bar. We didn't see a lot of it being used because most buyers still wanted to buy, and sellers were like, hey, I'll use my insurance proceeds, I'll put this back the way it was. But if the cost of restoration exceeds 1.5% purchase price, buyer elect to take the property as is or receive a refund and walk away. Not a very high bar. In NABOR, the seller is responsible for restoring the property back to its original condition as a condition of the contract. It's not negotiable. So the other big difference is seller's sole obligation with respect to tree damage is pruning and removal. In the NABOR contract, 1% of the property value, the purchase price, is the limit on the seller's requirement to put things back together, and redo the landscaping and so forth. So there's quite a few differences in this contract. I think I've been through a lot of the main points of it. Other than, some of these limited things. Remember here that if you're going to add an addenda, you got to check the box and include the rider. And there are 26 or 28 riders here. A seller's disclosure is not an addenda, right? If it's not a particular named addendum, or you're not adding one that's been, provided by an attorney or whatever, you don't need to put other lead-based paint addendum, seller's disclosure. Those are not parts of the integral parts of the contract, they're modifiers. So remember, especially that you do not want to get creative writing things here. We have a lot of language that you can use. But please don't start writing things in there. If you want to write seller to provide buyer $10,000 credit at closing toward their closing costs and prepaids, okay, that's okay. But if you're trying to say, well, if the radon is this and that, and the other, you can't, you've got to be careful that you'll be practicing law without a license, and you could be without a license for that. So again, they've added this attention seller and buyer just above the signature line now. So if you got a chance to go over the contract with the buyer before you send it off to the listing agent, great idea to say, hey, I just want you to look at this on 705 because this is a recent law, took effect July 1, and regardless of whether you're involved with any of these groups, you have to sign an affidavit of closing saying that you're not. I don't want there to be any surprises. This is the law, and if you want advice on any of this, I'll be happy to refer you to a qualified real estate attorney to discuss it, but I'm really not at liberty to get into any details with you. But I think the act of pointing it out, other than just sending it for e-signature, might be a useful thing. All right, so remember also that the sales contract is between the buyer and the seller, and the compensation cannot be altered in the sales contract. This contract shall not modify any MLS or other offer of compensation. So I see it in there, selling broker to get 3%. Even if it's signed by everybody, doesn't mean anything. The compensation is between the listing agent, listing broker, and the seller. And if it's going to be changed or for any reason, it has to be done by written agreement between the parties. Okay, so that's it. That's the FAR Bar best practices discussion. Hope it was worthwhile. Are there any questions or comments before we sign off?
No, Jeff, thank you, sir. Much appreciated as always.
All righty. Thanks for jumping on. And, as always, please feel free to email me or text me if you're in the middle of a contract and you need some assistance. That's what I'm here for. All right. Everybody have a great afternoon. Thanks for staying on a few minutes later and hopefully get some good information to you. Take care.